History is often defined by its epic wars. The relics left behind from those battles provide a map chronicling not only the evolution of man, but also the violent rearrangement of national borders.
Battle of Britain is about to begin.
No time period is more closely associated with the production of the tools of war and the realignment of nations than the years 1939 to 1945.
American Army is fighting for you.
World War II was a horrific, global struggle, fought on land, sea, and in the air, leaving tens of millions of people dead. Decades have passed since the end of the Second World War, but the question of what future generations will take away from history's most destructive conflict remains. What do the relics of the war say to us today? How will they be interpreted 100 years from now? What do the people who once wore these uniforms and clothing as combatants, victims, and survivors want us to know about their own personal role in World War II? There is a place for those who desire to find answers to these questions. The journey leads to a location that offers a very personal understanding of the true impact of the Second World War. In this setting, people come to reach out and touch history, interacting with leaders and generals, heroes and villains, soldiers and victims. They also connect with the relics of war, both awe-inspiringly large and ingeniously small. More than 6,000 original World War II artifacts are on display here, with no political correctness or agenda present. Based on the objects alone, visitors are encouraged to come away from this place with their own view of the true reality of World War II. Not how we see it today, but in the context of the 30s and 40s, when the anxiety of a world at war was all too real.
This is a jewel, this collection of World War II memorabilia.
I actually think what I saw here today is unbelievable. I never knew it existed.
It's important that everybody know what freedom is and how it's acquired.
They say freedom isn't free. It's costly.
West of Boston, Massachusetts, in this 10,000 square foot building on a quiet tree-lined street, is housed the largest private collection of artifacts from the Second World War. The Museum of World War II is the vision of one man who has spent over 5 decades assembling the most complete and personal collection of artifacts and documents from the defining moment of the 20th century.
The collection had really become a mission to preserve the lives of all these people and to preserve what really happened, the reality, and preserve it in a way that people in the future can look at the materials, look at the information people had at the time, not retrospectively, not what people wrote about it after the war, not distilled by historians, but just how people saw it at the time, what influenced them, and people could come to their own conclusions. That World War II is seen as a simple situation. It wasn't, but compared to now, people think of it as the good guys had white hats, the bad guys had black hats, you knew who was who, there were clear missions, nothing was ambiguous. Now we face a world in which everything is ambiguous.
Ken Rendell's World War II collection was evolving long before saving the artifacts and personal stories of the war mattered to most. For many in the early 1960s, the Second World War was still too fresh, a nightmare better left in 1945. The war would eventually have its place in history, but just not yet.
When I started collecting World War II more than 50 years ago, nobody was really interested in collecting it. I think it was so immediate to people. They knew people who had died. There were a lot of people who were wounded. I think it was just too immediate for people to think of saving it. There is no point of view in this museum. There's no political point of view. It's not anti-war. It doesn't glorify war. I present everything as it really was. And for that reason, people can take away very different experience from here.
And the time has come when every citizen must declare himself American or traitor.
The first bullet fired in World War II came as the result of a signature on a document officially ending another horrific war 20 years earlier. The National Socialist Party was born out of the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, dictating terms of Germany's surrender following World War I. A corporal in that war named Adolf Hitler saw an opportunity.
For the German people, the end of World War I was disastrous. You had numerous political parties, you had total turmoil. The currency was inflated staggeringly. The German military considered the end of World War I as a timeout. This was just a breathing spell for rest and relaxation and get ready for the next one. From my view, it's very important to see that lead up because that leads into the rise of Nazism. Nazism just didn't spring from nothing. Nazism came from the crushing situation at the end of World War I.
Sie wollte eine wahrhaftige Weltanschauungspartei sein. Und zweitens, sie wollte daher kompromisslos die einzige Macht.
Irmgard Schmid witnessed the rise of Nazism as a child growing up in Germany.
I was in third grade in school, in a school where uniformed men came to our school and put up posters of inscribed posters saying, Die Juden sind unser Unglück, meaning the Jews are our downfall. I had information coming from all sides. There were the posters, there were the soldiers coming in and saying Germany is the greatest, the best, the finest, and our beloved Führer Adolf Hitler, unser heißgeliebter Führer, stuff like that. In America, people would fall off their chairs screaming with laughter if we had to call any of our leaders hotly beloved.
Well, I think the Germans did an incredible job of mass marketing a war, and that's what they did. Everything was staged. Hitler was extremely aware of the importance of his image. He designed the Nazi flag. The banners were every place. The colors were very vibrant. The swastika actually is a very old symbol. American Indians used it. All kinds of cultures used the swastika. Hitler put the swastika on edge. He turned it because it was upsetting to look at the swastika on edge. He had an incredibly good sense of how to market a war. I mean, here he is, right out of a Wagner opera. He is literally the knight in shining armor riding in to save Germany. So all of this propaganda, all of this imagery was extremely important in building the image of Hitler.
On September 1st, 1939, German armies drove their way into Poland, signaling the start of World War II. The museum's collection, broken down into over 30 sections, begins its pursuit of preserving the reality of the war with Germany's Blitzkrieg, or Lightning War, into Eastern Europe, the emphasis on the awe-inspiring power behind Nazi war production in the early days of the fight.
I think that the German veterans that we've had here have a very realistic view of the war. I have not personally heard German veterans with revisionist points of view. They're pretty straightforward about the role that they played. If there's one thing that won World War II, what was it? You could certainly make the argument that Britain basically broke the codes for Enigma. Germany believed they could never be broken, so they always relied on the Enigma machine. They were certain that it was infallible. But Britain, a year into the war, was reading everything. Defeating Rommel in North Africa was done because the Allies knew when the supply ships were leaving Italy. They knew the routes they were taking. The Battle of the Atlantic hinged on this four-rotor machine.
It took the German army 27 days to overrun Holland, Belgium, Luxembourg, and France. In the summer of 1940, all that stood between the Nazis and the complete conquest of Europe was England. On July 10th, the German Luftwaffe began bombing British cities. The Battle of Britain was underway.
Churchill comes in when Germany invades France. Then you have the Battle of Britain, in which Britain barely survived. One is not really the way to term it. They barely survived it.
Out for hostile planes approaching from the southwest.
The British met the challenge by throwing in everything they had.
We had to carry gas masks all the time.
He forgot what it meant to have a night's sleep.
I was absolutely fascinated with what motivated the British people to fight. Hitler didn't want to fight with them. Hitler had appealed to them. What motivated them? Churchill did.
Upon this battle depends the survival of Christian civilization. The Battle of Britain is about to begin. Hitler knows that he will have to break us in this island or lose the war.
And my mother said she can remember so clearly the night they bombed Coventry. And that was when 2,000 bombers came over from... It was a constant stream of bombers going over. And of course, in the morning, there was nothing left. There was not a stone upon a stone left in Coventry. And that's like a city about as big as Boston.
If the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour.
Qu'a pris aujourd'hui le gouvernement britannique en reconnaissant dans ma personne le chef des Français libres a une grande importance.
While Great Britain battled the Germans for their right to exist, small groups began to rise up to fight back against the Nazi occupation, which by now had 300 million people under its iron fist. Unorganized at first and more of a nuisance, the resistance movement eventually grew and spread across all the countries of Europe and would play a significant role in harassing the German army for the duration of the war, especially in France.
Occupied Europe starts with resistance, and people think of the French resistance mainly because France is a bigger country, but there was a resistance in Norway and Belgium and the Netherlands. There was a resistance everywhere, but it was really hard going to resist an occupying army that would kill a large number of people for any infraction of their decrees. There are decrees here, if a telephone line is cut, 50 people will be killed. Well, do you really want to cut the telephone line? Tiny spy gadgets, like very tiny cameras inside matchboxes, cameras inside a cigarette lighter, and guns inside cigarette lighters, guns inside everything shot with bullets, fountain pens that, a cigar with a .25 caliber bullet still in it, cigarettes with tiny bullets. You pull the string between your teeth and it fires one shot.
Nachdem man das ablehnte, hab ich allerdings dann keinen halben Schluss mehr gefasst. Hier bin ich Nationalsozialist.
As soon as he assumed the title of Chancellor of Germany in 1933, Adolf Hitler began planning for the future of his 1,000-year Reich. Step one was eliminating those he felt were responsible for Germany's financial and moral ruin following World War I. At the top of Hitler's list were the Jews. The disabled, gypsies, homosexuals, and other non-designated Aryans would also be marked for deportation to the concentration camps or just methodically murdered where they lived. By the time World War II began in 1939, Hitler's killing factories and roving death squads had already exterminated thousands across Europe. That number would be in the millions by the end of the war.
There were all kinds of Hitler youths and SS men, SR men, having a bonfire in the street behind the church. And opposite the church was a synagogue. And it was, all the doors were boarded up, and the Jews had sort of disappeared. There were none in our school anymore, no Jewish school children, and they were, by that time, wearing yellow stars.
This area was designed to be very claustrophobic, to be very in your face. When you come into this area, the first thing that you are right up close to are these SS soldiers. And these are concentration camp guards. And their outfits, their uniforms were designed to threaten people. They're really a propaganda statement. The skull and crossbones on the top, the black uniform, the jodhpurs, very crisp looking, the red armbands. They're very shocking, and it was a really clear statement. When these people knocked on your door, it was over.
Israel Arbeiter was 14 years old when the Germans first entered his city of Plotzk, Poland, in early September 1939. One of 5 boys, his only crime was that he was Jewish. First came the German army, then the SS and Gestapo.
And people started to disappear. With the occupying the city by the SS, the occupation forces, and depriving us of the civil rights, at the age of 14, I was declared a slave, condemned to death for the only crime that I committed because I was born to Jewish parents.
Arbeiter and his family remained together in Plotzk until 1942, when the Nazis adopted the final solution of the Jewish question. All Jews were to be exterminated, either worked or starved to death or gassed in the concentration camps.
We were ordered out from our homes, leave everything there, assemble in the marketplace where a selection took place. The young and those that were capable to work were taken on one side, the very young and the elderly selected on the other side. We were, myself and 2 of my brothers, were selected among the young ones to go to work. My parents, my father, my mother, and my 7-year-old brother were sent to a death camp to Treblinka, and they were murdered by gassing and cremated. That was the most horrible day of my life, which is still with me. Seeing my parents for the very last time, knowing that I won't see them anymore.
Arbeiter, younger and stronger than most of his fellow Jews, survived 2 more years at a forced labor facility. In 1944, as the Russians moved west, the Polish teenager was given a one-way ticket in an overcrowded, wretched-smelling cattle car to the most infamous of all the Nazi death camps. There was absolutely no doubt in his mind he would die there.
We arrived, I remember, early in the morning, and we could see inside people with the striped uniforms. And now we knew that this is Auschwitz. There was a selection by the infamous Dr. Mengele, who, with the movement with the point of one finger, decided who was to live and who was to die. So that again, there were two columns, that those, in his opinion, are capable to work, and the others went one direction, and we went the other direction. We never saw the people that were in the other column again. You're in Auschwitz now, and the only way out of here is through the chimneys. 18,651. See, they had in Auschwitz, they went to 200,000. Thus, these were the numbers only of people that went into the camp. The people that were killed didn't get any numbers. And Auschwitz was the only camp that they gave numbers. To know that such a place ever existed on this planet, operated by human beings, by a government, the atrocities, what took place there is just unbelievable and cannot be described. And when they have little kids between 5 and 10 years old that were walking, they made them walk, from the selection area to the guest chambers area. And when they closed the door of the guest chambers, and you hear those little kids banging on the walls, on the doors, screaming, yelling for their mothers, to no avail.
In April of 1945, Izzy Arbeiter and any survivors left at Auschwitz were sent from the camp in Poland to Germany, where the Nazis planned to eliminate any remaining witnesses to their death camps. A month later, however, the German army surrendered. There would be those alive who could tell their stories.
5.5 years on the condition, on the guard, and being ordered and being told what to do and live under the worst condition. And now, what does it mean to be free?
Izzy Arbeiter's parents and younger brother died in the concentration camps. Miraculously, 2 other brothers survived.
No matter how long it may take us, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory.
We were on the Atlantic at Norfolk when the war was declared, and we went from peacetime on December 6th to wartime on December 7th.
America entering the war is production. That's the tank, all the guns, but all the propaganda, the home front, the situation in America, Pearl Harbor, and America comes into it.
The tank convoy heads for the Tunisian front.
This vehicle and thousands of others just like it were determining what happened. The largeness of the tank and the space that it's in overwhelms people. They're not seeing it out in the field. They're getting a sense of just how big it is and how menacing it is, and the sense of what happened in war. I mean, that war became these kind of vehicles, and people don't think of that, or they think of seeing a tank at a distance. So the tank has been enormously effective. I never cease to be satisfied when I walk around the corner and people just can't believe it. They can't believe how big it is, how evil it is, the armor plating, the reality.
The instruments of war for an American medic in World War II consisted of bandages, morphine, scissors, and a helmet marked with 4 large red crosses.
I went to basic, and they said, "Here, you're going to be a medic." No choice whatsoever. And during basic, we had half a day of medical training, the other half was infantry training.
The museum is full of ghosts, the ghosts of all these people who created and used all these things are kept alive.
While the Allies and Axis accelerated their weapons production following Pearl Harbor, they also stepped up the propaganda fight. Both sides aware that words and images were as important to the war effort as guns and bullets were to soldiers on the front lines.
There were propaganda stories that during the war, Germany became happier. The German population became happier. My father says Heil Hitler every morning. We have to say Heil Hitler.
The Museum of World War II's propaganda collection is one of the most complete in the world, and no government in history waged the public relations fight any better than the Nazis.
The images were incredible. I mean, you see right here the basic images that were driving Germany in the 1930s. You've got the beautiful young blonde woman, and then you have the guy. And underneath it just says, "And you?" ? And it's interesting that American propaganda was anti-Japanese, and it was anti-Hitler. It wasn't anti-German, because the largest ethnic group in America was German. But nobody knew Japanese Americans. So it was the whole Japanese nation and people we were at war with, and that led to the rounding up of Japanese Americans.
Thanks to the propaganda machine, Allied and Axis generals became household names during World War II. Dwight D. Eisenhower, Omar Bradley, and Bernard Montgomery grabbed headlines for the Allies, while Erwin Rommel did the same for Germany. One general, however, stood out from the rest. George Patton was loud, arrogant, and often in trouble with Eisenhower. But he was also America's most aggressive and successful ground leader in the war, and feared by the Germans.
I had the opportunity one day to go in and fix General Patton's trailer. So I got a chance to speak to him. He just wanted to know if everybody was okay, and the food was good. And I said, well, you know, K rations are K rations, so at least we filled our bellies and we managed to get along.
It's not behind glass. It's right there. And I think it increases the reality.
While Patton and the infantry slugged it out on the ground, in the skies over Europe, the workhorse of the 8th Air Force was making life miserable for Germany. Aboard a B-17 Flying Fortress, 21-year-old captain and lead bomber pilot Richard Dinning was completing his 33rd trip over Europe. For Dinning, coming to the Museum of World War II lets him reach out and touch his past.
There's a little gauge on the flight panel that's displayed here that is pegged at the low end at 60 degrees below zero. And there were missions that I flew where the needle was on the peg at 60 below zero. And one of them said it was so cold that the Luftwaffe was grounded. Well, we flew that day. And it was sort of a relief not to have the Luftwaffe to contend with.
543 Allied planes tried to blast the enemy out of the town with a load of 1,144 tons of bombs.
Not many bomber crews lived long enough to complete anywhere near 33 missions. B-17 pilot Henry Bengis made it to 21 before being shot down over occupied Europe.
Then we heard the famous words in World War II: for every captured airman, For you, the war is over.
The attack starts when a lone Nazi plane dives out of the sky, comes in very low, and unloads its bombs.
In North Africa in 1942, the British were slugging it out in the desert with Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps. England's most famous general, the egocentric Bernard Law Montgomery, was able to turn back Rommel's once unstoppable Panzer Army at El Alamein, and in the process become a legend to a hero-starved British nation. In November 1942, the Americans joined the fight against Rommel with the launch of Operation Torch, the first joint attack planned by the U.S. Army and British. By May 1943, Torch had contributed to the destruction of the Afrika Korps.
The British Eighth Army, represented here by a really typical soldier, dressed completely differently. You know, shorts, it was very hot. The pith helmets, there's one here, there's this guy has a pith helmet on. You were in the desert. It was a totally different kind of experience. And the Afrika Korps under Rommel was equipped for this. Lots of equipment didn't work in North Africa because of the sand. This is Bernard Montgomery. This is his beret that he wore during the African campaign, and this is how he looked. This is the mannequins in the museum of real people are the actual size, the weight, and in all of these cases, it's been very interesting that I had the children of these people pick out their eyes, and David Montgomery picked out his father's eyes.
On the Eastern Front, the Germans were reeling against the counterpunch the Russian army had delivered to them at Stalingrad in the brutal winter of 1942-43, a fight which many consider the turning point of World War II. Germany was no longer on the offensive in the Soviet Union as they had been since 1941's Operation Barbarossa. Now the Germans were being pushed back into Poland, leaving behind hundreds of thousands of men, either dead, wounded, missing, or taken prisoner.
This mannequin represents a lucky German soldier at Stalingrad. Lucky because he's got more or less winter clothing. And I've put actually a Russian jacket on him, which he would have gotten from a dead Russian soldier. But he's lucky. He has a hooded hat. They basically were totally unprepared. They knew that they were just going to win in the summer, that they'd never be there in the winter, so there was no winter clothing. And he's very fortunate. He's got large boots. Far more typical was anything that they could get to wear. And boots were actually made by the Germans out of rope. That's what these are. If Russia was not successful, all those German divisions would have been in France, and we never could have. We barely won in Normandy anyhow. And if we'd been fighting all the divisions that were in Russia, we wouldn't have won. The Russian front is extremely important.
Through the streets where the chariots of the Caesars once rolled, tanks and trucks rumbled past historic landmarks.
On July 9th, 1943, the Americans and British launched Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily. Italian-speaking American GI Frank Palilla's job was to convince Italian partisans still aligned with the Germans not to interfere with the invasion.
I was only 18 years old. Mostly it was to convince the Italians to side with the Americans. And so, you know, we would roam the areas and go to clubs and go to prisons and stuff like that to convince the people to side with us.
In September of '43, the Allies pushed off from Sicily to invade Italy itself. In January of 1944, the Americans landed on a 15-mile stretch designated the Anzio beachhead, 30 miles south of Rome. The 4 months following the landings would turn out to be some of the most savage fighting of the entire war.
It was very fierce because the Germans already had outposts and they were well defended. There wasn't a crossroad or a hilltop or a mountaintop which they didn't already have covered with artillery and with machine gun and small arms fire. It was very, very difficult to move day or night.
After 21 years, a free Rome laughs again. A free Rome speaks again.
Backing up the mightiest invasion by air, 4,000 ships, combat and landing craft land hundreds of thousands of British, Canadians, and Yanks on Hitler's doorstep. Shock troops move in for the beach assault.
Don McCarthy knows what it's like to face death at the water's edge. On June 6, 1944, McCarthy went into Omaha Beach in Normandy as part of the initial wave of Operation Overlord, the invasion of Northwest France. Most of his fellow soldiers in the 29th Infantry Division, who went in before McCarthy, were already dead.
I reached a point where I could see that I had to talk to God in a real hurry. And I remember looking up to God, and I yelled, God, no matter what it is you want me to do, I'll do it, forever or the rest of my life. At that point, Colonel Cannon, who was my regimental commander, had come along in the smoke and said, okay, guys, get off the beach, get your ass up here, get up to the beach and run. And it was almost simultaneously. And he yelled, 29, let's go. And we did. We got up to the berm, and we made it to the berm, and managed to get up there, soaking wet. So, I mean, we're talking about a beach that's like a quarter of a mile long to get up. And how I managed to get there, I don't know, but God was helping me.
Also fighting for his life on bloody Omaha on D-Day was 29th Division platoon leader Morley Piper.
No, you tend to pray a little. We were told that the Germans held the high ground above the beach. We knew there were fortifications along the beach. We'd been told that. We didn't know exactly how bad it would be, but we expected it. We were told that a lot of us wouldn't be back. We started to hear bullets on the side of the boat, so we knew then what it was going to be like when the ramp went down. When the ramp went down and we started coming in, I think organization kind of went up in smoke. Everybody was running around with survival on their minds more than anything else. It was pretty hard to form any kind of a cohesive attack plan at that point.
Soldiers, sailors, and airmen of the Allied Expeditionary Force, you are about to embark upon the great crusade toward which we have striven these many months. I have full confidence in your courage, devotion to duty, and skill in battle. We will accept nothing less than full victory. Good luck, and let us all beseech the blessing of Almighty God upon this great and noble undertaking.
4 miles to the east of Omaha Beach on D-Day, landing craft assault boats carrying 225 Rangers were heading for Pointe du Hoc. Their Rangers would have to assault a 100-foot-high cliff to neutralize 6 155mm artillery guns Allied intelligence had determined were set up and able to fire on troops and ships at Omaha and Utah Beach. What the Rangers didn't know was the guns had yet to be installed. Tom Ruggiero's LCA, with fellow 2nd Battalion D Company soldiers aboard, never made it to shore.
Next thing I knew, when we got within about 800 yards from the point, we were taking an awful pounding, and one shell hit just in front of the bow of the landing craft, just picked it up, and we had almost half full of water already. It just flipped it over. First thing I know, I remember hearing our captain then saying, abandon ship. We had no choice. We were dumped right into the water, and we lost 5 guys.
Of the 225 Rangers assigned to scale the 9-story high cliff, 90 would be left standing when the fight was finally over on Pointe du Hoc. Tom Ruggiero was rescued after floating for 2 hours in the 42-degree temperatures of the English Channel. The Allies knew the water would be cold on D-Day, but it was more the wind and clouds that had their attention prior to June 6th. In England, a team of meteorologists was responsible for providing Allied Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower with the weather report that would decide if the Overlord invasion would launch or be postponed, as had already been done once. Early June 1944 saw the worst weather in the Channel in 20 years, and American weatherman Dick Luxner and his team had to get the forecast right.
The important part was that you had to have some kind of weather that was clear enough so you could have air cover. You had to have high tide. You had to have as close to a full moon as possible so you could see what you were doing. And the high tide was so you could get over the barriers on the beaches. And the weather was stormy all the week before.
Eventually, the meteorologists saw enough of a break in the forecast to forward the news to Ike, who gave the order that the D-Day invasion would go on June 6th.
What I cannot create, no museum can, and what no person today can experience is the anxiety. The anxiety that you are going to get killed the next day. You could be horribly wounded the next day. That maybe the next day, half the people you're with are going to die.
Arriving on D-Day +1 as part of the 82nd Airborne's 325th Glider Infantry Regiment, 2nd Battalion, was Wesley Coe.
It was a sight to behold. You know, it took, over 700 gliders to move a regiment. And we flew 3 abreast at the altitude of 600, 800, 1,000 feet.
Coe's glider, towed over the Channel by a C-47, was set free as it came across the Normandy coast.
I guess about every glider crash landed. Some overturned, some lost their wings, some got down intact, but damaged, but got down intact. Fortunately, I was in a glider that no one was hurt.
You look at how much stuff they had on. They could not get up into the airplanes themselves. They had to be pulled up. They were wearing hundreds of pounds of gear.
There is no blinking at the fact that our people, our territory, and our interests are in grave danger.
Then the Pacific War, and that's the difficulty of running, because it was parallel in terms of time, but since it was such a totally separate, troops didn't go from one area to another. The troops for the Pacific were the troops for the Pacific. It was a totally different war.
And that war, fought on islands most Americans couldn't find on a map, was run by the Allied Supreme Commander in the Pacific, a general who was many things, including aloof, courageous, controversial, and brilliant.
He required the highest kind of work ethic and creativity too, if that was ever in the books. I don't ever recall him making a personal remark to me that indicated I was the only woman on his staff or anything of that kind.
Collecting the Japanese part of the museum has been the most difficult. The collection of Japanese posters is the biggest display of Japanese posters anyplace, and it consists of about 12. Americans, they didn't want any souvenirs from the Japanese. The Japanese were so brutal, they didn't want any connection. But if they did take anything, it was a silk flag, because Americans landed on these godforsaken islands in a landing craft with a backpack, and they left. But some of them took things that they took out of the backpacks of Japanese soldiers, pictures of families. And that was the reality.
This is the landing right here.
On Iwo Jima in March of 1945, Sammy Bernstein witnessed that, after he was told the island was secured and the fighting over.
Monday morning at 4 o'clock in the morning, 26th of March, 1945. 250 Japanese came out of the ground on a banzai. The banzai means they come out about 4 o'clock in the morning and they will commit hara-kiri, when the sun comes up. They will die, kill themselves. The theory is that they're to take 10 Marines with them before they die. And they're fanatics now. They're going to die anyway. Arthur Erdman, my senior, got up and said, "Sam, you stay with the gun. You can't leave the gun alone in the foxhole. I'll go out and see what's going on." He didn't move about 10 feet away. He was hit with a saber by a Jap. I put the 2 cartridges into my rifle, M1, fired twice. I hit him, but he kept coming and fell on top of me. And I had to use a K-bar. But I really didn't know what I was doing. But I fought him off, and I survived, here by the grace of God.
On the famed American aircraft carrier USS Lexington, radio man Bill Connolly saw his ship go down in the Battle of the Coral Sea in May of 1942.
They found us the next day, and we found them at the same time. Our planes were attacking them while their planes were attacking us, and the Lexington was damaged badly, and we finally had to abandon the ship later in the afternoon.
The USS Yorktown was also badly damaged in the Coral Sea fight, but in only 3 days the aircraft carrier was patched up and back in the fight a month later at the Battle of Midway, perhaps the most important naval engagement of the entire war. The Yorktown eventually sank at Midway on June 7th, courtesy of Japanese torpedoes, but not before Ensign Joe Gross and his crewmates on board had helped to turn the tide in the Pacific.
That was the end of the war for Japan, because we not only sunk 4 of their carriers, but we wiped out their entire naval air force.
The home of freedom is once again the home of free men, and the victorious end of the Battle of Europe is at hand.
The end for Germany came on May 8, 1945, as they unconditionally surrendered to the Allies. Hitler was already dead, committing suicide on April 30th on a sofa inside his bunker in Berlin as the Russian army advanced. World War II in Europe was finally over after almost 6 years. Left behind was death and total destruction.
It's after the war. Nobody had any memory anymore. They didn't know what had happened to the Jews. They didn't believe the concentration camps. They denied everything. They were never in the Nazi party.
People ask me, how did you survive? There's no answer.
The world will note that the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima.
Japan's war came to an end 3 months after Germany's. It took 2 atomic bombs to finish the job, in the process ending plans for an Allied invasion of the Japanese homeland, in which millions would have died. Almost 6 years to the day Germany invaded Poland to start World War II, Japan's unconditional surrender marked the end of a global conflict that had left between 50 and 70 million people dead. Hundreds of thousands of others were wounded and crippled, and millions more displaced and homeless. The capitals of the Axis, Tokyo and Berlin, lay in ruins.
It was devastated. It was nothing standing.
All that was left was to assign the blame. That process began to play out in Germany in November of 1945 as the Nuremberg trials got underway. In the end, was World War II really the good war? Will we always look back on the cause and see it as just? Do the artifacts that remain today in this museum influence us in any way in how we perceive man's most epic and horrific fight?
We were fighting for one cause, to get rid of somebody that was doing a lot of harm in the world.
Most of the
fellas my age, we felt the same thing. We wanted to get in there. We thought the war would be over before we could get in there. And we just wanted to get in and win the war and come home.
All the time, I kept wondering, am I doing enough? And it is still, every once in a while, I often think, especially when I was in Europe, did I do enough? And why am I not laying there with those boys?
Yeah, I thought about that all my life, and you do wonder why I make it and then others did not.
I lost two brothers too in World War II. George was killed in Guadalcanal, awarded the DSC, and is buried in Pearl Harbor. John was shot down on his 26th mission over Germany.
The feeling that we're not going to make it was sort of all pervasive, you know, as not just on D-Day, but as the days lengthened into months and finally into a year. It's remarkable that I made it all the way through.
One area that does not seem open for interpretation is the stark realization World War II took an emotional toll on those caught up in its path, from innocent victims to heroic combatants.
Dearest Heart, how I wish this cruel business of war could be completed quickly.
The letter that I think is the most important is a very long handwritten letter from Eisenhower to his wife, in which he's writing to Mamie about fairly routine things. And then there's a new paragraph, and he says,
"It's a terribly sad business to total up the casualties each day, even in an air war, and to realize how many youngsters are gone forever. A man must develop a veneer of callousness that lets him consider such things dispassionately, but he can never escape a recognition of the fact that back home, the news brings anguish and suffering to families all over the country. Mothers, fathers, brothers, sisters, wives, and friends must have a difficult time preserving any comforting philosophy and retaining any belief in the eternal righteousness of things."
That letter was written 2 years after Eisenhower was in the war. And the fact that his humanity lasted, that he still had tears in his eyes, is fantastic. It's wonderful that he could still experience the reality and value human life.
War depends on real toughness, a fiber not only in the soldiers that must endure, but in the homes that must sacrifice their best. Always, Ike.